A koala sits in a tree. It barely moves. It almost never comes down to drink. And its name in the original Aboriginal language is said to mean exactly that: no water. That is the story everyone tells, but the real history of this word is stranger, older, and far more interesting than that tidy little fact suggests. To understand where the word koala comes from, you have to go back to the land around what is now Sydney, Australia, in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The Dharug people, also known as the Dharug, had lived in this region for tens of thousands of years. Their language, Dharug, was one of dozens of distinct Aboriginal languages spoken across the continent, each tied to specific country, specific knowledge, and specific ways of naming the world. When British colonists arrived in 1788 and began spreading out from the coast, they started encountering animals that had no European names. The platypus, the wombat, the kangaroo, and a strange, gray tree-dwelling creature that seemed to sleep its entire life away in the forks of eucalyptus branches. The colonists needed a name, and so, like they often did, they borrowed one from the people who had always been there. What they heard, and how they wrote it down, tells us almost everything about how language crosses cultural lines and how much gets lost in the crossing. The word koala enters the written English record around 1808. That is the date most etymologists point to as the earliest printed appearance in colonial documents. But here's where things get complicated. The spelling was not settled. Depending on who was writing and what they had heard, the animal's name appeared as kula, kulla, and kula. These were not random variations. They reflected the genuine difficulty English speakers had in transcribing sounds from a language with a completely different phonological structure. One of the key early figures in documenting the animals and peoples of the Sydney region was John Price, a servant to Governor John Hunter, who is often credited with one of the earliest written descriptions of the koala around 1798. Price encountered the animal near the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney, and recorded a name that Dharug-speaking people used for it. His account, though brief, became one of the reference points colonial naturalists would return to. By 1828, we have clearer documentation of the word in natural history records. This is the earliest reliably sourced record that etymologists have confirmed. By this point, European naturalists were beginning to formally classify Australian fauna, and the borrowing of Aboriginal place names and animal names was becoming standard practice, even if the understanding of those languages was thin. Another important figure in this chain is George Perry, a naturalist who published descriptions of Australian animals in the early 1800s. Perry and others like him were working from second- and third-hand accounts of what Aboriginal people called various creatures. They were not linguists. They were collectors and classifiers. So the names they recorded were approximations at best, and sometimes outright guesses assembled from brief cross-cultural exchanges. The drift from kula to koala is a textbook example of what linguists call phonological adaptation. As the word moved from spoken Dharug into written English and then back into spoken English, the vowel sounds shifted to fit English patterns. The final form, koala, is actually one of the further steps from the likely original pronunciation, which was probably something closer to gula or kula, with a hard consonant at the start that English speakers consistently softened. That hard G or K sound is important, because it leads us directly to the misconception that has followed this word for over 2 centuries. Here's the story you have probably heard. The word koala comes from the Dharug word gula, meaning no water or does not drink, because koalas get all their hydration from eucalyptus leaves and never need to drink. It is a perfect story. It is clean, it is poetic, and it fits the animal's behavior so well that it feels like it must be true. The problem is that the linguistic evidence for this translation is at best disputed and at worst invented after the fact. No confirmed authoritative record from the Dharug language definitively links a word meaning no water to the animal's name. What we have instead is a word, gula, or kula, whose meaning remains genuinely unclear in the surviving fragments of the Dharug language. The hydration fact itself is real. Koalas do primarily hydrate through eucalyptus leaves, but the leap from that biological fact to a clean etymological origin is exactly the kind of retroactive storytelling that language myths are made of. It is the sort of explanation that gets repeated because it sounds right, not because it has been verified. Despite the uncertainty around its roots, the word koala is now one of the most globally recognized borrowings from any Aboriginal Australian language. It sits alongside kangaroo, wombat, and dingo as part of a small collection of words that made it from Australian Aboriginal languages into global English. In recent years, as Australia has invested more effort in documenting and revitalizing Indigenous languages, Dharug has become one of the more actively studied and taught Aboriginal languages in the Sydney region. Schools in Western Sydney now offer Dharug language programs, and community linguists are working to reconstruct vocabulary from the limited colonial-era records. In that context, words like koala have taken on a new resonance, connecting contemporary speakers back to a linguistic tradition that was nearly erased. The word also appears constantly in conservation contexts, product branding, and national identity discussions, often carrying an implicit claim to a deep connection with Australian land that its complicated colonial history quietly complicates. The borrowing of koala is part of a much larger pattern. When British colonists arrived in Australia, they faced a continent full of creatures, plants, and landscapes that their existing vocabulary simply could not handle. The result was a wave of borrowings from dozens of Aboriginal languages, most of them from the coastal and southeastern regions where early contact was concentrated. Kangaroo came from the Gugu Yimithir language of far north Queensland, recorded by Joseph Banks and James Cook during the 1770 voyage of the Endeavour. Wombat comes from the Dharug word wambad, or wambad, making it a close linguistic neighbor to koala. Dingo is also Dharug in origin from tingo. These words share a common path, heard by colonists, written down imperfectly, then standardized over decades of print use. What is striking about all of these words is how little the colonists understood about the languages they were borrowing from. They were not doing ethnography. They were doing something more urgent and more careless, trying to label a world they did not yet understand. The words they preserved are valuable precisely because of that accident. For linguists working on Dharug today, words like koala and wombat are not just animal names. They are data points, fragments of a language recorded under difficult circumstances that can be cross-referenced with other sources to reconstruct meaning and pronunciation. The word koala, uncertain origin and all, is part of the evidence base for understanding a language that was suppressed for most of the 19th and 20th centuries and is now being carefully, painstakingly brought back. So the next time someone tells you confidently that koala means no water, you now have the full picture. The clean explanation is appealing, but the messy, colonial, linguistically complicated truth is what the word actually carries with it.